I'm actually quite excited about the opportunity to present to everyone today here. This is my eighth B-Sides, and I've had a pretty good run in this part of the world. I was fortunate enough to keynote B-Sides Cymru in 2019 when they started their B-Sides up and spoke at B-Sides London. So I'm disappointed that I'm not able to be in Dublin with everyone, because I love visiting your city, but I'm grateful for the opportunity to share my knowledge with you any way that I have the opportunity. So I'm briefly just going to give you a little bit of background on some of the things I do to kind of give you the perspective of where this information is coming from. And then I'm hoping that this will help you to understand a little bit more of the particulars of what some of the threat actors are doing with the different kinds of threat actors that we see attacking organizations these days, and to help you allocate your time and money in the right places in order to best defend against those attackers. And so this is sort of my brief action plan. And my role at Sophos is interesting now because, of course, we have managed threat response and rapid response services for people, both in a monitoring capacity, but also from a response when they're getting hit with ransomware attacks and things. So it's allowed me to kind of gather a lot of information in a more, I hate to use the word holistic because it makes it sound like it's a bit not real, but previous to this, our perspective was purely from the point of detection and going through lots and lots of malware samples, doing our very best to make sure that those malware did not impact people's systems. Now we can kind of see the whole attack chain and how different tools are being detected at different stages, and what methodologies victims or defenders are employing in order to stop different stages of those attacks, and kind of seeing where people are having success and failure in defending against those attacks. And so we've kind of got more pieces of the puzzle now, right? Because we can do in-depth analysis of the malware itself. And so this information is what I've used to kind of feed into today's presentation to share with you kind of our current view of what's happening in that threat landscape. And we'll start with, I think it's important to know who, and each of you will have to put yourself in some perspective as to understand whether specific threat actors may be a risk to your organization or not. But I think for the majority of us, all of them will. If we put them in high-level buckets, I kind of have things in three categories now. I have sort of the professional attacker who works in the nation state. And you'll probably fall within one of two categories when it comes to nation states, no matter who you are as an organization now. And this may come to a surprise to some of you, but ones that you may work in an industry where you very much expect to be the target of a nation state. You may be working in defending a government agency, or perhaps someone developing a vaccine, or these types of things, maybe defense. Traditional places you expect your nation state adversaries to be poking around. Nothing really changes for you, right? I mean, this has been going on for years, and if you're in those kind of organizations, you've always got nation states looking into your business. What's more concerning is some of the nation states have seemingly shifted to, if not directly attacking civilian targets, making open season on civilian targets for people to meet their ends. And the two most common that we're seeing out there, the reason I have the two little pictures down in the corner there is that's a hidden cobra and a static kitten, two of the threat groups, of course, that are known to be involved in some of this. But because of their behavior, I mean, it's particularly North Korea, which is generally represented by cobras and snakes and things like that by some of the other security companies. They're kind of after everybody right now. In essence, they're using ransomware to fund their nation state to some degree. The FBI estimated that in 2020, over 10% of the gross domestic product of North Korea came from cryptocurrency thefts and ransoms. So can you imagine 10% of your entire economy now is running on stolen digital money done through cyber attacks? It's an astounding figure. Granted, North Korea doesn't have a very functioning economy. It doesn't have a great GDP, but this is a survival skill for them at this point. And they are not targeting typical nation state targets. They're targeting anyone they can rob and steal from. And it's gotten a bit out of control. And I think most famously, we're all aware of the Wannacry attack a few years back. And of course, Wannacry was ultimately attributed to North Korea. And while they didn't make any money on it, I think they learned from some of the mistakes they made, and they recognized the opportunity for how much money they could have made, considering the gross amount of damages that were caused to just a few organizations in that attack, and understood the value, the monetary value in doing this. So I think, when we look at Iran, they seem to be in a very similar position, and they seem to be maybe marching down the same path. It's a little fuzzier in Iran exactly what's going on, but we have seen an increase in crypto mining attacks and an increase in ransomware coming from Iran as well. Like North Korea, they have sanctions, so they may be eyeing a similar model for ways to get hard currency from foreign nations to come into the Iranian economy. And the victims that I've investigated with the team at Sophos and others that we're aware of have all just been regular civilian organizations. They're not organizations with an affiliation with the government, with the military, with the army, anything like that. They're just companies that can be attacked to make money off of them. And the perpetrators seem to be, I don't know if they have a seal of approval from the state, but they certainly don't seem to be offending the state. The state is not taking any action to stop any of this activity. One of the people we wrote a blog post about recently that was deploying crypto miners from Iran actually runs a legitimate computer business in Tehran. He doesn't even hide his name or address or anything. We could just look him up on look him up on GitHub and see the source code for some of his malware on his GitHub that's directly tied to his business name, which suggests that there's nothing to fear. If it's not official government approval, it's tacit government approval. But it means that kind of every organization in the world now has nation states either funding or interested in coming after them, and maybe not with the same sophistication they have when they're after the secret super duper missile plans and things like that. But it certainly is stepping up the game, and it's also muddying the water. When you're doing an investigation of an attack, it's getting less and less clear. And I don't know how much time I'll have to go into details on this, but a lot of the tools and techniques that are being used by nation state attackers are the same as we're seeing in this middle bucket. And that middle bucket there with the hacker stickers on the laptop, I kind of call them advanced persistent thieves. This is the upper echelon. In the title of the presentation, it said the stratification of cybercrime. And what I was referring to there is that we are kind of getting these layers of sophistication now. At the top layer, clearly it's the nation states themselves, not necessarily their endorsed citizens who may be attacking people. They have the most sophisticated tools generally. That next step down, I call advanced persistent thieves, and that's your Ryaks and your Revels and your Contis and these ransomware gangs that are regularly in the headlines asking for $1 million+ ransoms. We've seen upwards of $30 million in some of the victims that we've helped out. I saw, of course, last week it was in the news that Acer Computers was hit and demanded $50 million, right? The people doing those kind of crimes are in this advanced persistent thief bucket. And to be fair, most of their skills seem to be in that zone of a mid-level pen tester, let's say. I know a lot of people that do pen testing, and there's a few of them that truly and generally scare me, and I worry for my own network if they were to come after me, even though I spend so much of my time and effort focusing on how to secure it. The mid-tier ones are the ones that I have confidence that I can block, but I have to make an active effort to block them. It's not easy to keep those mid-level people out. I have to consciously do a lot of things in order to secure my network. But if I do them, they're not getting in. They're not giving talks at Black Hat anytime soon. And these are the ones I think that are the most dangerous. I'm going to spend the most time talking about today, because that's the ones of the quantity of them out there that are starting to really take down our networks in larger and larger numbers. And they're not interested in consumers, right? So we've seen this real shift in the attack economy. Well, we're not seeing the mass drive-by stuff we used to see in the days of Flash and Java causing so much disruption. And that's all shifted into targeting organizations for large sums of money and picking them off one at a time using human-led attack skills rather than wormable exploits per se. And the last category there, that's a little cut and paste action that you see on the right, and they're still out there and causing some trouble. I mean, the what do you want to call them, script kiddies, or what you want to refer to them as? There is a lower tier of people trading hacking tools. They don't really understand how they work, and they're just kind of throwing everything at the wall to see what sticks. And they have plenty of success, right? There's two particular ransom groups still doing this. One's called Dharma, another one's called Stop Ransomware. Great information coverage on those if you're interested in learning more about how they work. We've written some articles on our blog, as well as Bleeping Computer always has fantastic information on ransomware groups and detailed write-ups. And they're having success against the low-hanging fruit. So if you do have some unprotected assets out there, they may get hit by some of these groups. They may hit desktop computers within your organization for a few $100s or a few $1,000s equivalent, per victim, but they don't have a lot of success, right? Because they don't have 0 days, they don't have Java and Flash to attack anymore. Their social engineering skills are weak at best in a lot of cases. So they're really just throwing out quantities and hoping a few things stick. But on average, some of these groups are netting between $1,000 and $50,000 per victim. So it's still a pretty good day at the office if you're a criminal to do that activity. So now, if we look at the how do these things change from the way they were a few years ago? And we've seen this evolution coming over the past 10 or 15 years, but it was rather slow moving until recently. If you remember, if you've been working for a while in this business, you probably remember the age of exploit kits. They're still out there, but largely exploit kits, they shined from the late 2000s to the mid 20-teens. Black hole exploit kit was probably the most famous one, and that was kind of the beginning of this idea of there being specialization in jobs of how you provide tools to others to commit the crimes, right? Whoever was behind the black hole exploit kit, I can't remember the guy's name, he was eventually arrested. All he did was write the exploits and then sell the kit. He didn't deploy the malware. He didn't write the malware. He was just what we would now call an initial access broker, somebody who gets initial access to a victim's computer and then delivers a payload on behalf of someone else. And that was kind of the beginning of this sort of stratification of the underground markets where they became jobs. And around that same time, we also saw there was mass credit card theft going on, particularly in the United States, because they had not adopted chip cards yet. And it was very easy to steal credit card mag stripes from memory. And in that time period, we started seeing that market do the same thing, where suddenly one person's job was to manage the money mules that would use the stolen cards to go get money out of cash machines. And that's all that person did. They didn't know anything about malware. They were people. They just knew how to recruit and herd those mules to go out and take money out of cash machines. And somebody else's job within the criminal group was to acquire blank plastic cards and imprint the mag stripes with the stolen card information so that then they could be taken and used by those mules. And somebody else's job was to write the malware to collect those mag stripes into memory. So we've seen this expand out further and further as this criminal market has gotten more and more well endowed with cash, let's call it. And there's lots of this trading going on. And most of it, unfortunately, with the groups that we're most interested in, is being done behind the scenes. We're not seeing this being done in the open. Occasionally, we do see people selling, for example, ransomware as a service through some forums that we have access to. In particular, you see that with groups like Revil. They do have affiliates, and they do sometimes recruit somewhat openly for affiliates. But as far as the relationship they have with their money laundering groups or things like that, those transactions are mostly done in private, but we can tell that they're distinct groups in many cases based on code analysis, based on analysis of ransom notes, based on other ways we're able to analyze things. We can kind of see there's repeat operators doing jobs for different groups and different people in order to get these things done most efficiently, because they're very good at them. And primarily you see, of course, money laundering usually being done through cryptocurrencies, of course, lots and lots of Bitcoin wallets and coin tumbling and moving things from Bitcoin to Ethereum and back to Bitcoin, and then ultimately cashing it out through over-the-counter traded stocks in China and things like that in order to make the money disappear. Another specialization that I'm sure you've experienced in your inbox, and hopefully you noticed it, which is the quality of the phishing attacks is increased dramatically, and they're hiring professional translators to write their emails and write their document lures so that they're in correct English, Spanish, French, German, whatever language they're targeting. In particular, the English language ones, the quality of them is no longer such that you can spot the mistakes. And again, for the lure, that's important. The ransom notes are still a grammatical nightmare, but they don't need to at that point. They once you're the ransom note stage, there's no reason to pretend that they're not criminals. They're admitting they're criminals. In fact, they're trying to use it to intimidate you. So they're putting the focus and effort into the social engineering lures, but they're hiring professional people that are native speakers of those languages to help craft these phishing attacks, which is leading to a much higher yield of victims that are getting drawn into those attacks. And of course, professional coders of different skill sets are helping write the malware. And again, there's a bit of a distinction with some of the groups. I don't think it's actually that important to study the groups. I think it's important to defend against all of them. But we do see some groups specialize in being technically sophisticated and coming up with new ways to bypass protection technologies like NetWalker and Doppelpaymer, whereas other groups like Revil and Maze, before they retired in October last year, seem to focus in the hype, right? It's all about I'm going to dump the data publicly. I'm going to try to get media attention. I'm going to embarrass the company until they pay. And while their malware is sophisticated enough, it's not employing new techniques that we've never seen before to bypass technologies. If you've got solid technology in place, you're generally somewhat safe unless they can turn it off, which is a whole other kettle of fish. So, and anything can be for a price. I just went hunting around on some dark websites that I monitor occasionally, and this was just an example of what we were talking about. I found Vladimir and George here, who are offering services of different hacking things, what they'll do for how much money, and you just get an idea of it's somewhat in the open. It's always done in Bitcoin, even though some of the underground markets now are under heavy pressure to move from Bitcoin to Monero. So you'll see especially the markets selling drugs and guns and malware are being pushed strongly toward not accepting Bitcoins anymore because of the traceability and moving to Monero where they have more anonymity. And I suspect, Bitcoin will probably vanish from those markets. Bitcoin's never going to vanish from the ransomware market because victims know what a Bitcoin is, they've heard of it, and they can probably buy it. And that's really important to the crooks. But when they're buying things from each other, they want their anonymity from one another as well, because there's been a lot of takedowns in the last few years by the international law enforcement, and that's one of the ways they can ferret out who's doing business with whom. And by getting Bitcoin out of that, it lowers their risk another level. So we'll talk a little bit about TTPs, or how they're actually doing this. I wanted to take an example of one of the more sophisticated modern attacks that we had the opportunity to document. And I found I was looking for images of what a Conti might be, and it turns out it's a Portuguese beer. I don't know if it's a Portuguese or if it's Brazilian Portuguese, but I found that can of Conti that I thought, well, that's kind of odd. I don't know what the actual malware is named for, but this is sort of the process that they took getting into this particular victim. They first they got to get that initial access. And again, remember, this is probably a different group than Conti themselves. It's unlikely that any of the modern ransomware groups are actually hacking into your network. Somebody else is hacking into a computer, recognizing that, oh, wait a minute, I broke into this computer, and look, it's part of a company, and this company's large enough that they probably have some money, and maybe I can sell this victim on to these ransomware guys that I have a relationship with through the underground. And in this particular case that we were investigating, it was an unpatched FortiGate firewall that they broke in through from Fortinet. That the patch had been out for months, but it hadn't been applied, so it was kind of easy pickings for the and this is pretty common. Almost everything we see in 2020 at the beginning of these attacks starts with a hacked remote access device of some type. They're either attacking the Citrix or what was called the Citrix vulnerability at the end of 2019. They're attacking FortiGate. They're attacking Pulse Secure VPNs. They're attacking sometimes. I'm trying to forget the name of it now. That starts with an S. But they're going after VPNs and other remote access stuff, and above and beyond that, RDP. If there's an RDP server open, they're just going to pound it guessing passwords until they get in, and or just phish somebody for a legitimate password from the IT team, especially one that might have the ability to elevate privilege to administrators. So this is almost always how they're getting in at the start. Occasionally they start with a phishing attack or a document, but most of the investigations we did in 2020 always come back to some remote access device that was either unpatched, the credentials had been previously phished, and there was no multi-factor authentication, or was just legitimate access, again, without multi-factor, that they were able to password guess. And then the first thing they did was deploy Cobalt Strike in a very generic fashion. And if you follow DerbyCon and many of the jokes in the InfoSec community, you can look up #TrevorForget about a bug in somebody's milkshake. They literally use that code verbatim for the HTTP stager for Cobalt Strike in the attack. They didn't even bother modifying it. You can see the screenshot in the lower right that we discovered on the victim's machine, and that matches up with publicly published things called the Trevor Forget code. Then they did a reflective attack and loaded a sword loader of interpreter into memory. And again, this was an entirely fileless attack. And this is one of the other challenges when you're in the panic of dealing with one of these incidents and you're responding to them. You want to figure out what the criminal's been up to and how they got in, because they're unlikely to give up if you knock them off of one server. And in fact, I don't have all the details here. If you're interested in more details, go to our news.sophos.com blog. We did an entire write-up on this attack with all of the technical detail of the malware and technical detail of how the attackers pivoted around the network. But they got onto one server, and eventually the IT team was able to get control of that server, recognize that they were there, lock them out again, but they'd already pivoted to more servers. And because it was fileless, it was really hard for the victim to trace where that thing had gone and where it might be in their network. And so they didn't realize another server was compromised, where the attackers continued their attack, even though the defenders thought that they had locked them out. So this is becoming more and more common. And then they loaded another piece of Cobalt Strike into memory. They double obfuscated it. They both obfuscated it using a packer, but in addition to packing it, they also did what's called API by hash, where instead of calling API names by the name of the API, for example, like get host by name to do a DNS lookup, you actually hash the API names and you call the hash of the API name rather than the API name, which just makes it miserable to reverse engineer for folks like the people that helped me out in Sophos Labs. And then it wormed over SMB all around the network. Once they had valid administrative creds, they can copy it to the dollar shares all over the network to spread the malware around, to position it in staging. In this case, they actually embed a RSA public key into the malware itself so that they don't need to contact command and control. So as soon as they infect the machine, they don't need any outbound access to a command and control server, because the public key is built into the malware, and they just put a unique public key in per victim because it's being deployed by hand. It doesn't need to be automated in any fashion because humans are actually behind the keyboard publishing it. This is almost a hallmark of a lot of ransomware attacks now, which is the data gets exfiltrated to Mega, which is Kim.com's file sharing service that he hosts. Depending how you feel about Kim.com, you may be a fan or a not fan of Mega. But that's where a lot of the data is being exfiltrated now. They'll often bring along a client that can connect directly to Mega's APIs and do the upload to accelerate it, make it a little faster than doing it over HTTPS. But if that doesn't work, then they'll just run it through a proxy and just go to the Mega website and do it that way. They've got several different utilities that are commonly used. And then ultimately, of course, publish some of that information on the dark web in order to extort the victim into paying. So that's sort of the flow of a very typical attack. And mapping this out loosely into not very definitive attack framework buckets, but just kind of giving an idea again. The beginning is sometimes a fish, clearly probably not Emitet anymore because Emitet's gone, but it's the most famous example I could think of that was successful in the last year or two, and through remote access devices, whether that's Citrix or Pulse Secure or RDP, proceeding on to living off the land. And this is just pretty much every attack now, right? We do not see the criminals almost never bring their own attack tools. If they do, they're heavily obfuscated PowerShell, and they're doing that reflective DLL loading into memory where they can do fileless attacks and nothing hits the disk to not trigger a lot of antivirus and things like that. And heavy use of and abuse of tools that are already present and used by that IT team often. We've even seen them go to the point of using your software deployment strategy internally to deploy the malware itself, and scanning your network using copies of Nmap that they find laying around, using pskill, psexec, all the sysinternals tools. A lot of reliance on PowerShell these days, and Cobalt Strike and Interpreter frequently used as well, which is a little surprising to me because it's so well known to security tools. It's bound to set off an alarm somewhere, but they are still using them. And disabling backups, especially cloud things like Veeam, they'll look for S3 buckets or Veeam services, those types of things to kill your backups if they're online. Too many companies are no longer doing offline backups. They're not sending the tapes in the bucket off to the warehouse to be stored. And because of that, they can delete them while they're online and put the company in a worse position. And of course, in the end, they've got a gun to your head. I've got about 5 more minutes left, so I'm just going to talk about defense before we get ready For those of you that stayed in track one, it's an all Canadian ending to Besides Dublin. Strangely enough, my friend and colleague Rob Slade before me did a fantastic job talking about homomorphic encryption, and I'll have the great pleasure of being the last person to speak before Dave Lewis does the lock note. I'm curious what a lock note is. I've been meaning to ask that, but Dave's another well-known person in the Canadian security community, and I hope you'll enjoy his presentation as well. And on the sort of prevent, detect, and respond side, I mean, this sounds stupid, and I'm really getting sick of saying it, to be honest, but every victim we're helping out these days just had bad hygiene, poorly configured firewalls, and often no logging, no SIM, or no EDR. These are really the most important parts on the prevention side. And I know firewalls sound like a very 20th century idea, but you need to think about firewalls maybe differently than you used to. And when I'm saying on a prevention side, I'm almost talking about preventing this from growing out of control. We're talking about segmentation in the network as much as we're talking about, I mean, ideally you'd be moving to SACE and ZTNA and these types of things so that you're not worried about firewalling, but most of us aren't there. So if you're not there, like almost every other organization, you do have firewalls. And if you do have firewalls and you do have an inside network and a DMZ network and all these kinds of things, then you need to be segmenting more. And I mean, every major attack that's gotten out of control that we've been involved in, and everyone I've read about in the press, there's been zero segmentation in those networks. Once the criminals are able to find one way in, there's nothing to stop them from running roughshod over the entire network and all of the data. And it's such a cheap rudimentary thing. They don't cost any. You can run them in virtual machines now. Like this isn't, you're not buying WatchGuard boxes and racking them like you did in the old days. So, really look at how you might use things you already have like that better and get better at segmenting. EDR is absolutely essential because when you're trying to react to a situation, you need to know what's going on and you need to know quickly. And you don't want to have to paste together 7 different systems information in order to try to figure out what's happening. And certainly our threat responders find EDR to be the most useful new tool in the arsenal. Like most of the things we rely on are actually old things that don't cost much money. Just need to know how to use them effectively. It's not about buying new shiny stuff. It's about being more strategic about how we use the old shiny stuff. But in the case of EDR, I would say that's the exception. And I heard about a new victim last night that we were helping out. And again, they had unpatched Exchange servers despite all the information about Hafnium going around. They had a plan. They were planning on patching against the Hafnium vulnerabilities this weekend, but instead they got hit with the ransomware yesterday, so a little late for them. And unfortunately, that 2-3 week delay in patching is more than enough to make them a victim. And so many of these cases, even reasonably well managed environments, we still see that 80 of the servers were protected, but 10 of them weren't. And that's all it takes is one of them. And then they can unlock the other ones. And in many cases, most cases, if they can, the first thing they do is disable the security on everything else. They only have to find the one unprotected machine that's a member of the domain, and they can unravel the whole thing like pulling the thread on a sweater. So it's essential that it be ubiquitous. And if you spend all of your time on hygiene, you'll be far better ahead than if you spend all your time trying to do far more sophisticated things if you're not that far along on the security maturity spectrum. And you have to just recognize where you are in that maturity and focus on what you can do at the maturity level you're at. Don't try to leap ahead because you'll fail at everything as opposed to being really good at least one thing that's going to help defend. And then, of course, threat hunting, if you're mature enough, is the next step, right? You need to really be able to detect and respond. And when the criminals break in, more often than not, there's a few telltale things that slow them down, and there's a few telltale things that they're often doing. And more often than not, within the first hour or two of them breaching the network, to me, I liken it to if a burglar were to break into your house and knock over a plant on the way into the house and it shatters and you hear it in the other room. If we compare that to detecting a piece of malware, say Cobalt Strike or Meterpreter being detected on a machine in your DMZ, you might say, hooray, my Sophos antivirus or my CrowdStrike or whatever I have detected Cobalt Strike, fantastic, close the incident because it worked. But the truth is, you need to open an incident because somebody's trying to get in and it's a human, and they're not going to give up because Sophos or Cobalt or CrowdStrike detected their Cobalt Strike, right? They're just going to come back in 10 minutes with an obfuscated one or a different tool that's not going to be detected by vendor Y or product X. And so when you hear the plant breaking, when they break in the room, you need to be in the position to to start an incident response. And segmentation, looking for things after hours and looking for data exfiltration are the primary ways you're going to see that something bad was happening. So my time's up. I hope you found that informative. I'll hang out in the platform thing if there's questions later and anybody wants to chat. And thank you very much for your time. I hope that was useful.
Thanks, Chet. That was a very, very, very good talk. You raised a lot of questions around the source of Conti beer in the chat, so that was a good
Is it Brazilian or is it Portuguese?
Apparently, someone said Conti's from Brazil, and then someone said I'm from Brazil and I've never heard of that beer. So, the question still remains. Thanks for your time, Chet. I'll hand over to Anthony now, who will have your fellow countryman Dave close us out with his block note. Thanks, Chet.